Gimel. Okay, so let's pick up Yesh Bazeh Madrego Shonos. Right, so maybe let's pick up for the first paragraph on page Gimel. Right, is that correct, Mush? Or do we step to the new section?
Well, I think we're in the middle of it.
Good. So let's begin at the top of that paragraph. The Yesh Bazeh Madrego Shonos. Remember again, yesterday the Mechaber was talking to us about the very dramatic example of Yosef HaTzadik, and specifically again how Ruvain felt that Yosef stood a better chance at surviving this ordeal if he were to go ahead and be thrown into the pit of snakes and scorpions rather than fall into the hands of his brothers. And the logic behind that was that at least in the pits of snakes, since the pit of snake and scorpions, Ruvain understood that his fate was in the hands of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And by definition, he would have to reach out to the Ribono Shel Olam to try to figure out these circumstances. He'd have to rely on his emunah and his belief in hashgacha. Masha'inkin, if he fell into the hands of his brothers, it would be easy for him to think that somehow, some way, his fate and his plight is dependent on them. And of course, all of this is part of the. Oh no, I'm sorry. We did be okay. We began the next section. I'm sorry. So all of this is in an effort to recognize that the Ribono Shel Olam is the one who choreographs all of man's events, and everything that occurs in my life is choreographed by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And even though someone else may actively play a role in delivering the pain or delivering the hurt or delivering the difficult circumstances, I view myself ultimately again as I view that individual as the staff in the hands of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But we'll say, but with that, let's pick up on the second section. Lo ipol la'atzvos me'akishalon. Gam kasher adam sovel ekev tayus kishlonos. Ukiyotze bazeh dvar matlim l'chorem bebechira shalom. Tzarchu ladas sha'amnam lifnei shuta. Haisela bechira litos. אבל עכשיו, אחרי שכברת, צורך להאמין שיש לבורא מסר בשבילו, ולכן אין לו לרדוף את עצמו, וליפול להאשמות עצמיות ולחלישות הדעת. So we begin to speak about this yesterday, that if you understand, we're speaking about the three different categories of life adversity. We'll call the first one life adversity, where something negative happens to me that's clearly divine. Sickness, illness, other things in life that are just nothing to do with any other person or me. Stuff happens. Category number 2 is other people hurt me. And that category number 3 is where I make mistakes and I end up compromising myself. So category number 3 is an interesting one because it's clear that if I'm making a mistake, then I am responsible for that. I brought that upon myself. That's clear. The shaila now is, what do I do with that? So the Mechaber says over here the following, and both say this becomes the fine line. On one hand, as we often say, the buck of my life stops with me. So I have complete responsibility for what occurs in my life. Complete responsibility. On the flip side, one side, let's say I make the mistake. I own it. I bear responsibility for it. If it's something significant, I do tshuva for it. But Lamais, at the end of the day, afterwards, says the Mechaber, it's important to understand that even this mistake I made is part of Hashgachas Hashem. It's part of divine providence. Now, again, the reason why this is a delicate dance is because sometimes we think of Hashgachas Hashem as the Ribono Shel Olam controls it. So if God is controlling it, it means that I am not. So strange, keep shutting off. So we often think that it means that if I am controlling it, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is not. But that's, of course, not what the Mechaber means. What the Mechaber means is I have complete control. But at the end of the day, the way events unfold is part of Hashgachas Hashem. So after I make the mistake, and I own that mistake, I do tshuva for my mistake, I ask myself, what's the message in this mistake? And I will say it's a very profound way to live. How do I grow from this? How do I learn from this? After a person makes a mistake, you have two choices. Choice number 1 is beat yourself up over it. Choice number 1 is feel horrible about it. Choice number 1 is, feel like I can't believe I did this. And the truth is that is an important part of growth. But at some point in time, I have to move on from that and ultimately move into growth mode. So growth mode is, now that this occurred to me, this is part of the hashkacha of the Ribono Shel Olam. How do I navigate through this? Excuse me. The explanation of this is simple. Bevadai Adam hama'amin yodea shekasher hu itzliach bebechiraso zerak mipnei shemishamayim azru lo bazeh chayiv kol adam ma'amin lahodos. Well, this is actually very profound. So what's the logic about this? In other words, that I could easily say that when I make a mistake and I mess up, so why should I say there's hashkacha in that? Meaning, maybe I just made a really bad mistake. The Moshe made me a bal bechira. I have free choice. Because I have free choice, and at the end of the day, if I abuse that free choice, or I wrongly use that free choice, I am responsible for what's occurred. So, meaning, how do you know automatically that there's an element of hashkacha in that? And maybe I just messed up. Meaning, maybe this is not God. You know, this almost like goes to that. I think I've mentioned this before. It's a famous mashal in Sefer HaChinuch, where he writes, if a person is walking down a path, and the path is lined on both sides with thorn bushes, and I walk too close to one of the sides and I cut my arm. Is that hashkachas Hashem? Is that divine providence? So actually what we're going to see is what appears to be a very simple mashal is actually going to be the subject of a fierce debate. Sefer HaChinuch happens to be of the opinion and say, I don't know why you're getting into theological matters. You're not careful. You weren't vigilant. You got cut because you walked too close to the side. It's not really about God. It's about your own lack of care. So the Mechaber clearly would say that is not correct. The Mechaber would say yes. Well, I should say differently. The Mechaber would say, I agree with you. I got cut because I was not careful where I walked. But there is an element of hashkacha in these events. In other words, so what is the message I take? The Ribono Shel Olam is trying to teach me something. There is a self-transcendent experience to be had in this, and what is it? So I'm not freed from the fact that I wasn't careful enough where I'm walking. And by the way, sometimes, in life, self is the very message. Sometimes when you walk too close to the thorn bush and you get caught, the very message is you're not vigilant in the pathways you're taking in life. I'm not careful where I'm walking. I'm not careful where I'm going. I'm not careful what I'm doing, and I'm not attentive enough to the way I'm living my life. That could be amongst many other things the message. That's the point that Mechaber is making over here. So Mechaber says something amazing. He says, I'm going to tell you this simple explanation for this. He says, a person has a success in life. Yes. So what happens? A person is hitzliach b'bechiraso. Says hitzliach b'bechiraso. I go ahead and I make a good decision. Baruch Hashem, sometimes we have those, right? I make a good decision. I make a good deal. I'm matzliach. So what does every Jew say? What does every Bala Muna say when something goes right in life? Baruch Hashem. Baruch Hashem. And really, we know that's not just lip service. Really, when we say Baruch Hashem, what we're really saying is, listen, you know what? I realize there are so many moving pieces in this Hatzlacha. There's no way I pull this off by myself. The Ribono Shel Olam, people say, God's my co-pilot. The truth is, I'm God's co-pilot. God's not my co-pilot. I'm His co-pilot. Meaning, at the end of the day, I recognize that, yes, although I put in my hishtadlus to make this deal happen, to make this event happen, to make this good thing, it was the Ribono Shel Olam. It was absolutely the Ribono Shel Olam. Velo zemarash yeshel gaiva. Shorni aslichti. The converse will say this, of course, is if a person says, oh, no, this wasn't God. This was me. This was me. Now, if a person says this was me, then what? That's gaiva. Then that becomes arrogance. Therefore, Yelachain, kulam omrim tamid b'siyata d'shmaya, be'ezras Hashem, chazdei Hashem, Hashem azra li v'chulei. That's why I will say when people say that ultimately, again, should be with siyata d'shmaya, divine help, be'ezras Hashem, or I should say divine providence, so that or celestial help of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the chesed of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Ribono Shel Olam help me. So there's ideas that when things go right in life, there's a recognition that this is occurring because of the Ribono Shel Olam. Imkein, chayiv adam hama'amin lahodos, shegam hu ta'a b'bichirasav, gam zeh achrak v'nei shemishamayim lo azri lo. So this is a very profound way of looking at it. If my hatzlachos, if my successes in life are because God helped me, then why do I fail? What's the converse? Because HaKadosh Baruch Hu didn't help me. So Baruch Hu didn't help me. In other words, what that means is that God has allowed, in a certain respect, for this failure to occur. Now again, I can't stress enough. You have to be careful not to interpret this as a lack of bechira, because the moment you interpret as lack of bechira, that's very dangerous, because then what ends up happening is a person lives life with a feeling of no responsibility for anything. And that, of course, again, is not correct. Therefore, again, says the Mechaber, the idea is, if my successes come about because the HaKadosh Baruch Hu helped me, my failures come about because the HaKadosh Baruch Hu didn't help me. Meaning, he didn't help me to be successful in this. He didn't help me to avoid this pitfall, which is fine. I love the Kabel as a kishlona shelo b'emunah b'yavav v'lo mamen. And therefore, we'll say the message is a very simple one. The same way that HaKadosh Baruch Hu's help is there to send me some message of self-transcendence, to send me some message of growth, so HaKadosh Baruch Hu's lack of help is also there to dispatch to me a message. This is an incredible yesod. The same way that I have emunah that HaKadosh Baruch Hu helps, I have emunah that HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't help. Obviously, all of us would much rather have A and not B. I'd much rather learn lessons from the Rebbe Shalom's assistance than from the Rebbe Shalom's lack of assistance. But nevertheless, says the Mechaber, there are two sides of the same coin. At the end of the day, L'maisa, again, sometimes HaKadosh Baruch Hu helps me and I'm successful. Sometimes he doesn't help me and therefore I'm not successful. But both of those situations yield the same reality, which is a reality of emunah, which is a reality of belief, which is a reality ultimately, again, that all of my life lessons contain some level of self-transcendent lessons. We'll stop over here for today. We got a little bit of a 2-minute head start on the daf. We'll pick up the last 2 lines of Pei Gimel in Meretz Hashem tomorrow. All right, so we'll say good morning. Let's begin. So today's daf is Kuf Lamed Vav 136. We actually have a lot to do today. We are picking up from Kuf Lamed Lamed Beis 135b Va'od Tashma. It's 2, 4, 6, 8, 9 lines up and down. So we'll say. So remember again, we were discussing the interesting topic regarding the following. Everyone agrees that a shchiv mirah who goes in and makes a declaration to go ahead and convey property, ultimately, again, is able to convey property just through his dibur, just through his speech. The interesting question that comes up is what happens if the shchiv also says to go ahead and convey property through a shtar. So the question is, what's the status of that conveyance? Does the Shchid Meirah mean to say that I only want it to be conveyed through a shtar, or is he saying that no, I still want it to be conveyed as a regular Shchid Meirah? What's the nafkamina? The nafkamina, let's say again, he dies before the conveyance of the shtar. So if you go ahead and you say that Lamaisa, again, the shtar was just there to bolster the fact you could convey it even after his death. On the flip side, if you say that Lamaisa, again, if you say that he was only meant to convey it through the shtar, shtar achamisa. So that the Gemara says, "Va'od tashma, Rabbi Lazar Amra." Excuse me, "Va'od tashma, Rabbi Lazar Amra." The Shalach Rabbi Mishmei Rabbi Abahu. Habu Yodim sheshalach Rabbi Lazar legola mishum Rabbeinu. Rabbi Elazar sent to the Gabas in the name of Rabbeinu, Shriv Meira, Shamar Kisvu Utinu Mana Leploni Umes. A Shriv Meira who said, write and convey a mana to so-and-so, and he died before the gift was conveyed. Ein kosvin v'nosnin. We do not go ahead and write it and give it. Shema lo gamar lahaknoso ela b'shtar. Because it could be that the Shriv Meira's intention was only to convey it through the shtar. Ve'in shtar la'achamisa. Rabbi said there is no such thing as a posthumous, there is no such thing as a shtar that is delivered after death. Rabbi Yochanan says we have to investigate. Now, what should we investigate? Mighty badek. So the Gemara says, Ki aser Ravdimi Amar daitiki mevatelas daitiki. So we'll say when Ravdimi came along, he taught us a couple of things. Number one, we'll say remember a daitiki is a shtar for a Shriv Meira. Right? It's a document that a Shriv Meira writes for the conveyance of some kind of property. Now, interestingly enough, the halacha is the following: has certain rights that a regular person does not. So among them, primarily number one is his ability to go ahead and convey property just by verbal declaration. The other possibility that the Shriv Meira has is that even if he's conveyed something to someone, he could retract that gift and ultimately what? And ultimately give it to someone else. That's daitiki mevatala daitiki. I will say, because remember again, the logic over here is that the gift of a Shriv Meira, remember, is only chal, only takes effect when? After his death. So if any time before his death he retracts the gift and chooses to give it to someone else, he has that ability to do so. That's not the point where it's focused on. We're focused on the next point. And furthermore, Shriv Meira shamar kisvu numara leploni umes, of Shriv Meira who said, write a document and convey a money to so-and-so, and he died, wrote it. So we'll say we examine the nature of the document or of the command to write the document. Im kimiyafes kocho kosvin, if the point of the document was only to bolster the ownership of the recipient, in other words, to bolster the ownership of the recipient, not to be a form of conveyance, but to be a form of bolstering that ownership, then we write the document. In lav, but if not, in kosa. So we'll say what the Gemara now is suggesting over here is the following: that we look at the nature of the document. And there are different types of documents. Documents can sometimes be a shtar, can be used as the mechanism of conveyance of ownership. And shtar sometimes could just be what's called a shtar, could just be a source of proof, ultimately, again, that the transaction occurred or that ownership exists. What the Gemara is suggesting over here is the following: if the Shriv Meira was commanding the shtar to be written up as the mechanism of conveyance, then that only works if the Shriv Meira is still alive. Once he dies, you cannot use a shtar to affect the kinyan. On the other hand, if the Shriv Meira was saying write the shtar to bolster the ownership of the recipient, then einachinami, that can be written even after death. So says the Gemara, Massive Rabbi Abba Bar Mamo, Bari Shamar Kisvut Numana Leploni Umes. The Bari, a regular healthy person, says, write a document and go ahead and give a mana to Ploni. And then what happens? He dies. The Bari dies before there is the opportunity to execute the transaction. So what's the halacha? Kosvin v'nosnim. You have the ability to go ahead and write and, thank you. In kosvin v'nosnim, thank you. We do not go ahead and write the document. Write the document and convey it. So what do you infer from here? That's by a Bari. But by a Shriv Meira, kosvin v'nosnim. By a Shriv Meira, we could infer that what? That you would go ahead and write it and convey it, even if the Shriv Meira died. To which the Gemara says last time, most of the so we'll say he answers it by saying, yes, what type of shtar do you go ahead and write even after the death of the Shriv Meira? A shtar that was not meant to be a mechanism of conveyance, but rather a shtar that was meant to be a shtar raya, just a shtar that ultimately, again, bolsters proof or supports the proof of the transaction occurred, and that ultimately, again, the object is owned by the individual. That could be written even after the death of the Shriv Meira. To which the Gemara says, so what's an example of a shtar that is there just in order to go ahead and increase or bolster the ownership of the recipient? Top of Kof Lamed Vav, we'll say, Kidam Rav Chisda. Rav Chisda says the shtar that has the following verbiage: V'kanina minei Mosif al matanasa dina, and we have acquired on his behalf, or we have acquired from him, Mosif al matanasa dina. So if you look at the Rashbam says, he says it's the last couple of lines of Kida Amar Rav Chisda, V'kanina minei Mosif al matanasa dina kilomar hakinyan eina ela tosefta ba'alma liapos es kocho. So we'll say, so the shtar essentially says that we, the witnesses, have acquired on behalf of the recipient, but that kinyan itself was only an additional measure. In other words, the shtar essentially says that the recipient acquired this property through the mechanism of shchiv meirah, and the existence of the shtar is just simply there to bolster his ownership. So the Gemara says, so I'll say, so too over here in this case, the case would be where the shchiv meirah goes ahead and essentially says, I'm conveying the property to or object to so-and-so, to Ruvain, and Eidim, please write and sign a shtar confirming these facts. Itmar Rabbi Yehuda or Shmuel, halacha kosvin v'nosnin. We'll say, so really saying Shmuel, the halacha is that we go ahead and we write a shtar on behalf of a shchiv meirah, and we're even willing to deliver it after his death. V'chein amar Rav Nachman, halacha kosvin v'nosnin. So we'll say, so halacha l'maisa, the way we paskin is the following. Can you deliver the document of a shchiv meirah to the intended recipient after the shchiv meirah's death? And the answer is, it depends. What does it depend on? It depends on the nature of the shtar. If it's clear that the intent of the shchiv meirah was to utilize the document as a mechanism of conveyance, then halacha l'maisa again, the shtar cannot be delivered after death because ein shtar la'achar misa. If on the other hand, the conveyance was already done, conveyance was done, but the shtar was just there as a shtar raya, as a proof to the ownership of the individual, such a shtar can in fact be delivered even after the death of the shchiv meirah. I will say that is halacha l'maisa. Mishnah, hakosev nechasav lebanav, sarach sheyichtov mehayom la'achar misa de Rabbi Yehuda. So let's listen to this. Somebody writes his property to his sons. That both say in this case over here, what's happening? Take a look at the Rashbam. So Rashbam says, hakosev nechasav lebanav, bari sherotza lisa isha. Ve'eno rotza l'shabei nechasav leishta peyavsidu banim sheyesh lamishta rishona. Rotza lichtov lahem nechasav la'achar moso. Excuse me. Ve'rotza lichtov lahem nechasav la'achar moso. Ela sheyochal peros bechayev. V'tzarech she. I'm just going to read Rashi, then we'll translate. V'tzarech sheyichtov mehayom la'achar misa. Demashra mehayom yekanu elecha guf levado. U'la'achar misa te nigmeras hamatana shetochal gama peros la'achar misasi. So let's listen to this. So the Gemara says the following. This is the sheep of Rabbi Yehuda. So the case over here, the way the Rashbam sets up the case is the following. A man has children. Let's say his wife, man is married, he has children, his wife passes away. He now wants to get remarried. So what happens? Now also remember, when a man gets married, all of his property becomes meshubet. All of it, there's a lien against all of his property by the ksuba. So let's say this particular man in question does not want a ksuba lien against his property because he wants his kids to get his property. He wants his children from his first marriage to get his property. So the Yehuda said essentially what you could do is you could gift your property to your children. I will say here's the problem. The problem is this man doesn't want to really fully gift the property to his children. Why? Because he's still alive and he wants to use it. So what he wants to be able to do is give the property to his children so that his wife doesn't have a lien on it, but that he still has the ability to use it. So it's like lahav, they're like right. There are contemporary examples of this where this comes up, especially again as people get older. As people get older and children want to ensure that certain assets might not be claimed by the government for their long-term care. It's just a lot of interesting ideas where people want to be able to essentially gift the title, but retain the use of the asset. That's what they're describing over here. So Yehuda says there's a very simple mechanism. You go ahead and you write a gift, you write a shtar to your children saying, Mehayom ula'achar misa. I hereby grant my property to you from today and after death. How do we interpret from today and after death? So from today means I'm giving you title, but reserving payros for myself. So the usage of the field, I'm still retaining for myself, usage of the property, but the title I'm giving you as of today. Now, the fact that he gives them the title as of today prevents the ksubalin from devolving upon any of his property, but because he retains the payros, he still has usage. So, according to Yehuda says the operative idea is you have to say mehayom, meaning you have to say it has to be in the shtar, mehayom ula'achar misa, because those two words, mehayom, means I'm conveying title to you as of today. Ula'achar misa, when I die, you will get the payros. Rabbi Yossi Omer Einot Tzarich. Rabbi Yossi says, no, you don't need this. Now we'll say, now we're going to see what Rabbi Yossi means when he says Einot Tzarich. He means you don't have to write Mehayom. You don't need that. You don't need that word. We'll discuss why. So the Gemara says, Hakosev nechasav libno la'achar moso. So we'll say, so let's say now following up in this case. Let's say again, Yaakov went ahead and got into this arrangement with Reuben. So he's his son Reuben. So Yaakov goes in and writes a shtar, and in the shtar it says, Mihayom la'achar misa, I hereby convey my property to you from today and after death. So we'll say, so what's the halacha? Ha'av eno yachol limkar, mipnei shen ksuven leben. So we'll say, so the father doesn't have the ability to go ahead and sell the property. Why? Because the title belongs to the son. V'haben eno yachol limkar, and the son doesn't have the son is not able to write it. Why? The son is not able to sell it. So what the Mishnah just points out is the only limitation in an arrangement like this is that Lamaisa, again, neither party can sell it. The son can't sell it because he doesn't own the peiros. He has the title, but he doesn't own the peiros. The father can't sell it because he has the peiros but doesn't own the title. Machar haben ein lokeh klum ad sheyamos ha'av. So what happens if the son does sell it? Now at the end of the day, the son has title. So his title says he's got to mean something. So why can't he sell the title? So the answer is he can't sell the title. He can sell the title, except again, the purchaser does not really have any rights in the property until when? Until the death of the father. So what it says, you know, what's like Kof Lamed Vav Amud Aleph, 3 lines in. Gemara. V'chi kasav mehayom la'achar misa my havi. So let's analyze this. So let's say again, the son is going ahead and writing, or excuse me, the father is writing. In this case, Yaakov is writing in the shtar, I'm hereby selling you or giving you this property. Mehayom la'achar misa. So let's say, so the way the Mishnah understood that statement is what? Father is conveying title now, but retaining peiros for himself. And it's the best of all worlds. The ksuvalin of wife number 2 does not devolve upon that property. Son gets the title, but father gets the continued usage ultimately again of the peiros. So you must understand what is exactly the effectiveness of writing this. Hatanan we learned, if a person goes ahead and writes for a get, Rabosai, I hereby give this get to my wife, mehayom, from today and after my death, get ve'eno get. So we'll say this is a suffix get. Now why is this a suffix get? Because we don't actually know what the guy's talking about. Do you mean to say that today it's a get mehayom? Is that what you're saying? In which case, fine, then the divorce is valid. Or are you saying la'achar misa? Are you saying that the get is only chal ultimately again after my death? In which case, you know, we'll say there's no such thing as a shumas get. Can't give a get achar misa. So we don't have to do it. This. Therefore, again, if the husband dies and this has not yet been clarified, what's the halacha? Choletzes v'lo misyademes. The wife does chalitza and not yibum. So what do you see from here? You see the Mishnah makes it sound like Rabbi Yossi makes it sound like, Rabbi Yehuda, that a lashon of mehayom la'achar misa is like such a beautiful lashon, so clear. The Gemara says it's not. It's a totally ambiguous lashon that we actually don't know what to do with. To which the Gemara says, Hasam misaf kalon itnahabi ichazarahabi. Here's the difference, says the Gemara. In the case of the get, we don't know how to interpret that phrase of mehayom la'achar misa. Does it mean, is the husband making a t'nai? Right? Is he saying that when I die, the get should be retroactively chal to today, which works, or is it a chazara? Or do we view the second statement as a retraction of the first? At first he said mehayom, and then he changed his mind and he said la'achar misa. Now, obviously, we're talking about a situation also here where the husband might not necessarily be available or be willing to clarify his statement. Aval halcha, but both say in our case of the Mishnah, hachi karmelei. This is what the father's saying. Gufa kani mehayom. I hereby convey to you ownership over the gufa of the property. I hereby convey to you the title today. Peira la'achar misa. But the fruits, or in other words, the usage of the property is only yours after my death. So both say this is indeed how Rabbi, we'll see what we say, but Rabbi Yossi Paskins that ultimately, again, this type of gift works, gives the son title. Both say, by the way, what this also potentially avoids is what? Is any need to, not to avoid, it also gives you the ability to divide up your estate however you want. In other words, we'll say, in a case like this, let's say I have 3 sons and I don't want to give my Bechor Pishnayim. I'd like to divide up my estate between my 3 sons equally. So we'll say, so again, we've spoken about this already. You can do that when you disperse your estate as a pre-death gift. So this would also work. Anytime you say, now again, in this case, the focus is different. In this case, the man wants to avoid a ksuva lien from his second marriage, but still wants usage of the property. So he's conveying title through mehayom, but ultimately telling his kids, you don't get use of the property until after achar misa. Rabbi Yossi argued in the Mishnah, and what did Rabbi Yossi say? Rabbi Yossi said, you don't have to say mehayom. Why not? So this is an interesting story. Rabba Baravua Chalash. Rabba Baravua became ill. All legabei Rafuna of Rav Nachman. So what happens? Rafuna Rav Nachman came to be Mevakir Chola. So Amar le Rafuna Rav Nachman. So Rafuna said to Rav Nachman, Ba'i minei to Rabbi Yossi. So Rafuna said to Rav Nachman, do me a favor. Ask Rabba Baravua if the halacha follows Rabbi Yossi or not. Do you have to say me'ayom or not? And I will say, now you have to understand something amazing. So anytime, first of all, when you have a lashon of chalash doesn't mean, he had a bad headache. Chalash means he's dying. I will say, it's fascinating to see that when somebody was dying, so the students flock around the deathbed. Often, again, it's of course bikur cholim, but just as important, it's also what? It's a last opportunity to clarify halachic questions. So here you have Rav Huna and Rav Nachman coming to Mevakir Chola to Rabba Baravua, who's dying. So Rav Huna says to Rav Nachman, do you think you could ask him if the halacha follows Rabbi Yossi or not? Meaning, again, because if he dies, and we don't have clarity on this, it just makes life a bit difficult. So Rav Huna says, do you mind if can you ask him? So let's listen to this. Amar lei, so Rav Nachman says, I can, but Taimet Rabbi Yossi lo yadana, halachi b'aminei. I don't even understand the position of Rabbi Yossi. If I don't understand the position of Rabbi Yossi, then how is it ultimately, again, that I'm going to be asking him whether or not the halacha follows Rabbi Yossi? To which the Gemara says, Amar lei, at ba'amine I halacha. Shabbos says, listen to this. So Rav Huna said to Rav Nachman, listen, here's the deal. You ask Rabbi Baravua if the halacha follows Rabbi Yossi, v'tamei ana amin halacha. I'll tell you the logic behind this position after you ask. In other words, I know Rabbi Yossi's svara. What I don't know is whether the halacha follows Rabbi Yossi. You go find out the halacha follows Rabbi Yossi, and after you answer that, I'll give you Rabbi Yossi's svara. So by me, so Rav Nachman goes over. Amrle, so he asks Rabbi Baravua. Amrle, Hachi Amarav, halacha Rabbi Yossi. So we'll say, sure, Rav Baravua said the halacha follows Rabbi Yossi. Now we'll say that you need not write mehayom ula achar misa in the shtar. Rather, apparently, even if you just write ula achar misa, that works the same way. In other words, that the father will then convey title to the property to the children now, but peiros after his death. Amarle, as I will say, so now Rav Huna says to Rav Nachman, you want to know the reason? Rabbi Yossi damar zmano shel shtar mochiach alav. I will say Rabbi Yossi is of the opinion that the date in the shtar essentially functions as mehayom. Rabbi Yossi's shita is, I will say, by the way, this is not just here. Rabbi Yossi has this shita in many different circumstances. Rabbi Yossi says, why is the date there? The date is there to tell you that there's an element of the shtar that is chal mehayom. Therefore, Rabbi Yossi says, you need not say mehayom, but rather mehayom is understood based on the actual date of the shtar. Tainam Nachir advice that supports this. Rabbi Yossi Omer, Eino Tzarich, one need not write mehayom in the shtar. Why? Ultimately, again, because in the shtar attests to the fact that the father is conveying the title to the property as of today, as of the date of the shtar. Incredible. So Rav Nachman has the following question. Good morning, Mr. Shofel. So we'll say, here's the interesting question. What about a shtar hakna? And we'll say, take a look at the Rashbam for just a moment. It's in the middle of the wide lines in the bottom. Back first two words on the line. Bakna mahu. Bishtar shekasuv bo kinyan mi palik Rabbi Huda umatrich lemichta mihayom umishumachi kami boile di ikal lememer de bishtar matana below kinyan pligi kigon shekasuv sadai nesunulacha la'achar misa umaslas hashtar. So let's listen to this. There are two different types of shtaros as we've spoken about. There's what's called a shtaraya, where again on both sides there was a separate kinyan done to acquire the property, and the shtar is just there to attest to the fact that the events occurred. But that shtar is not a mechanism or is not a vehicle of conveyance. Then there's what's called a shtar akna. We'll say shtar akna is, remember again, for example, karka. We know karka could be acquired in 3 different ways, and one of the ways is shtar. So we'll say, so let's say I use a shtar to go ahead and convey actual ownership over the property. So the Gemara is asking the following kasha: Bakna mahu. Does the machlokes Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi apply in the case of a shtar hakna or not? So the Gemara says, Amrle bakna inot tzarech. So he responded, everyone will agree that in a shtar hakna you do not need to write hayom. Rav Papi Amar, Rav Papi says, Ika aknaisa de tzarech, v'ika aknaisa de lo tzarech. There are some of us say shtar haknas that require mehayom, some that don't require mehayom. What does this mean? Watch this, Rabbi say. Akniye, so we'll say, so remember, the way also a shtar hakna works is the following. A shtar hakna tells a story. What does it tell a story of? It tells a story of a man who owned an object and tells witnesses to acquire this object on behalf of a third party, right? So it tells a story of Reuven, right, or of Yaakov, who says, I want to convey this property to Reuven. Please, witnesses, acquire this on behalf of Reuven. Right? You can tell a number of stories, but that's one of the stories it says. So the Gemara says, for example, if the shtar says akniye, if the shtar begins by saying that the owner of the object said to us, the witnesses, acquire, and then the shtar ends off by saying, Vikanina mine, and we acquired on his behalf. Now, the we in this case means the Eidim say, we acquired on behalf of the intended recipient, lo tzarech, then one need not write mehayom. On the other hand, if the shtar writes, Kanina mine, if the shtar begins by saying, we acquired on his behalf, ends off by saying, akniye, acquire, go and acquire on his behalf, tzarech, then you have to write mehayom. So we'll say, what's the distinction over here? Take a look at the Rashbam for just a moment. It's the Rashbam, Akniye bekanina mine lo tzarech. Zeh shekosen b'chol shtar shekasa bo kinyan shnei kinyanim. We'll say, so when we write a shtar, the shtar often mentions a kinyan twice. Where does it mention the kinyan twice? He says, Echad b'tchilas shtar. It says it once at the beginning of the shtar. V'kach amar lanu havu ale edim v'kanu mimenim. V'kanu mimenim. So the shtar often begins by saying that the owner of the object says to the witnesses, be witnesses for me and acquire on behalf of the intended recipient from me. The kis v'kasvu v'chasmu v'hainu akniye sheheknu li'edim b'kinyan suda v'skoslo l'makabel matana v'echad b'so. So we'll say, so the shtar begins with the owner of the object saying that I said to the witnesses, acquire on behalf of the intended recipient. Ve'echad b'sof hashtar, and I will say there's another mention of kinyan at the end of the shtar. V'kanina min ploni leploni kichol ma dekasav amafurash le'el. We'll say the second mention of kinyan in the shtar is where the witness is right, and we acquired on behalf of ploni in accordance with the instructions given to us by the owner of the object. So we'll say v'hilchach im kasav b'rosh hashtar akniye ubesof v'kanina. Hainu yipui koach the mashma shnei kinyanimu hikna v'gam anu kanino mine v'kinyan seru yipui koach liknos me'ayom aval kaser. Also listen to this. So therefore, again, written, if the shtar is written ultimately in a way where the first statement is the principal told us, the witnesses, to acquire on behalf of the intended recipient, and then what? The second part of the shtar says, and we, the witnesses, acquired on behalf of the intended recipient. Then what Rabbi say? Mehayom becomes irrelevant. Why does Mehayom become irrelevant? Because the shtar itself explicitly attests to the fact that the witness is acquired today on behalf of the intended recipient. On the flip side, Rabbi say, Rashbam finishes off and he says, Avalim kosa b'rosh hashtar v'kanina u'b'sof akniye the mashma kinyan echad the berusha kamefarish. Notice essentially what the Gemara says is the following: if the shtar makes it clear that the witnesses have already performed the kinyan of acquisition on behalf of the intended recipient, so the intended recipient effectively already owns the object now, there is no need to write mehayom. However, if the shtar does not indicate that a kinyan has been made on behalf of the intended recipient, then what? Then you must write mehayom in the shtar itself. To which the Gemara says, Maskif Rav Chanina Misura. So Rav Chanina Misura asks the following: Ni'ika midi da'anan lo yadina v'safri yadi. So we'll say, Rav Chanina is very bothered by this.
Amen.
Chanina is very bothered by this. Why? Because I was saying, what you're dealing with over here is such a nuance in Lashon. Meaning every star has both of these lashonos. Yet, if the star is written one way, you have to write me'ayom, one order of words, one order me'ayom. And if it's written a different order, you don't need me'ayom. So it comes on Rabbi Chanina and says, is anyone so well versed in the nuances of a star? Meaning, it's interesting. Rabbi Chanina of Surah says, we Rabbanim are not so well versed in the vigilance, in the nuances of the shtaros. Could you expect the Sofrim to be so vigilant in the nuance of the shtaros? To which the Gemara says, Shalinu l'safrei d'Abaye v'yadi. But also when they asked the Sofrim of the yeshiva of Abaye, and they were well versed in these nuances, or the Safrei de Rabba v'yadi, and they asked the scribes, the Sofrim of Rabba, and they were well versed. So the answer essentially was, yes, the Sofrim do know the difference in these Lashonos, to which the Gemara says, Rav Huna bar Yeshua Amar, Akniye v'kanina minei, ben kanina minei, v'akniye lo tzarich. It comes on Rav Huna bar Yeshua and says, it doesn't matter whether you go ahead and you write Akniye and then kanina, or kanina and akniye, you don't need to write me'ayom. Then we'll say, now why is he holding that way? The Pashtas he holds like Rabbi Yossi. Remember again, I will say, Rabbi Yossi holds that Mehayom is never necessary. Why is Mehayom never necessary? Because Malo Shel Shtar Mochiach. Because the date effectively says Mehayom. Ubeduchron Piskami Tahavu Ba'an Pana Pligi. So let's look at the Rashi for just a moment. Beduchron Piskami Shtar Evis below Kinyan Zichron Dvarim, below Zichron Kinyan. So listen to this. So the interesting question that does come up is what happens if you have a star that has no mention of a kinyan? What do you do in a case like that? Does that require hayom or not? So the Gemara says, Amrav Kahana, Amris Lishmaita Kamid Rav Zid Minarda, Vamrali. So Rav Kahana said, I said this over in front of Rav Zid Minarda, and he said to me the following: Asun Hachi Masnisala. This is how you learn it. Anan Hachi Masnilala. This is how we learn it. Amarav Nachman, Bakna Inot Sarich, Kanina Mine, Ben Kanina Mine, Va'akniye, Lo Tsarich. We hold that in any star that mentions the kinyan, you don't need Mehayom. Why? Because Lamaisi again you have the date. However, Biduchran Piskami Dahava Ban Pando Pligi, but when the star itself makes absolutely no mention of the kinyan, that's you have the Machlokes Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda. So we'll say, leaving aside the shtar that doesn't mention the kinyan, so the way we actually paskin about this in all of these cases is like Rabbi Yossi. We paskin again Zmano Shel Shtar Mochiach, and therefore again I will say in this type of situation, and by the way, this type of gift that the Mishnah is describing works. In this type of gift where the father is looking to convey principle or title, I should say, of the property now before he gets married to a second wife, but wants to retain peros, so he writes a gift, part of which is chal now, i.e. transfer of title, part of which will be chal only achar misa, i.e. the conveyance of the peros. He need not write mehayom. As long as what? As long as there is a date in the shtar, we pass like Rabbi Yossi, that therefore it means for the conveyance of title to be chal as of today. So the Gemara says the following. Hakosi, next case. Hakosi nechasol no lachar moso. So we'll say itmar. So remember again, I will say, one of the things that the Mishnah mentioned was what? Was in this type of setup where the father has conveyed title to the property, but not peros to the son. The peros only come after the death of the son. The son can't sell the property, and the father can't sell the property. If the son does sell the property, I mean, technically he can, but he's selling a future, right? Meaning he can sell the property, but lemaisa, again, the father, the intended recipient, is not actually going to get it until when? Until after the father. So itmar, machra ben bechaya agul meisa ben bechaya. This is an interesting case. So let's say the following situation. Case of the Mishnah. Yaakov is getting remarried. He wants to convey the property to his son Reuven before he gets married. So the ksuva lien of wife number 2 will not develop upon that property. So what happens? He gives over the title of the property to Reuven, but not the peros. Reuven then sells it to Avram. We'll call him, right? Reuven sells his right to a third party. But then what happens? Reuven predeceases his father, right? Reuven predeceases Yaakov. So we'll say what happens in a case like this. I'm in base. I'm going to be Yochanan, lo kana. So we'll say Rabbi Yochanan says that the purchaser Avram does not acquire anything. So lo kana lokeach. Ultimately, again, the lokeach. So and Rashban points out over here, lo kana lokeach afilu v'chishiyamo sa'av achrakach sheme'olam lo hayu ru'uyin labo lidihaben. So we'll say. So we'll explain this. Rabbi Yochanan says essentially because Reuven predeceased his father, therefore what? Purchaser, calling him Avram, has absolutely no rights. Reish Lakish Amar kana lokeach. Reish Lakish says no. The lokeach, the purchaser, will in fact acquire the field. We'll say obviously he doesn't acquire the field until when? It dies. But when the father does die, Avram does acquire it. So the Gemara says, also listen to this. So now we're going to analyze this. Rabbi Yochanan Amar lo kana lokeach. Rabbi Yochanan says that the purchaser doesn't acquire anything. Why? He holds kinyan peiros ke kinyan aguf dami. We'll say, watch this. Rabbi Yochanan holds that he who has the usage holds the real title. Right? He holds kinyan peiros. When you have usage of the property, so usage is the equivalent to actual title. Therefore, what they're both saying. Therefore, the son. So now let's be clear. Even Rabbi Yochanan will agree. Rabbi Yochanan will agree that this mechanism employed in the Mishnah works enough to avoid what? To avoid what? To avoid the shibud of the ksuva. But so again, the ksuva won't evolve upon it. But it doesn't really convey ownership to the son. The haraya, if the son sells his right and the son predeceases his father, that purchaser doesn't get anything because the father who has the peiros has the real ownership over the land. Reish Lakish Amar kana, Reish Lakish says no, the purchaser will acquire the rights when the father dies. Why? Because kinyan peiros lav ki kinyan aguf dami. Because Reish Lakish holds that kinyan peiros is not the equivalent to ownership. The title is ownership. Therefore, the son is the owner. Therefore, the son had something that he was able to sell. Just the difference is that the rights of collection only come upon the death of the father. So the Gemara says, "Well, fundamental machlokes Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish that is rooted in a more fundamental machlokes of how we view kinyan peiros. Is usage tantamount to title or not?" So says, 1 second. Va'ifligu ba chadazimna. But Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish already argued about this one time before. Ditmar, we learned, hamocher sadehu lepeiros. If a person goes ahead and what? Person is actually very interesting. I have a field. I should be zocheh to have a field in Eretz Yisrael one day, right? So what happens? Not even a house, just a field. Field is good. So the Gemara says, I have a field in Eretz Yisrael and I sell my fields for produce. So what I'm doing over here is I'm holding on to title. I'm selling the peiros to Reuven. So what happens? So we'll say, here's the shaila. Bikurim. Who gets to bring Bikurim? So Rabbi Yochanan Amar maybe Vikore. Rabbi Yochanan says, I will say that the purchaser, we'll call him Reuven, who has the rights to the peiros, he brings the Bikurim, Vikore, and he has the right to read the Psukim. Reish Lakish Amar maybe Vikore. Reish Lakish says, no, Reuven brings the peiros. So we'll say, but what? He doesn't get to do the Bikurim recitation. Why not? I'm sorry?
That's suffix.
Oh, so why not? Rabbi Yochanan Amar maybe Vikore. So Rabbi Yochanan says that Reuven has the right to not only bring the peiros, but what? To also go ahead and read the psukim. Kasavar kinyan peiros ke kinyan aguftam. Because he holds that he who owns the peiros is as if he is the owner of the property. Therefore, he has the right to bring the bikurim and he has the right to read the psukim. Reish Lakish Amar maybe ve'ino korei. Reish Lakish says no. Reuven brings the bikurim, which Avosa is an incredible schos in and of itself, but he doesn't have the ability to go ahead and read the psukim. Why? Because kinyan peiros lav ki kinyan haguftami. Because at the end of the day, kinyan peiros Avosa is not like kinyan haguf. So the point I was asking over here is, why do you need to go ahead and restate that machlokes over here? We have already learned that machlokes once. In other words, the machlokes of Yochanan and Reish Lakish is, do we say that usage is tantamount to title or not? Or not? Do our rights to produce tantamount to title or not? So why do you have to restate the machlokes over here? To which I'll tell you why. Rabbi Yochanan will say the following. Even though we normally say that's what? That kinyan peiros, that Rabbi say, entitlement to produce is the equivalent of title of ownership. Hacha, I would still say that Rabbi say in this case over here, in this case being the case of the Mishnah, where the father is conveying the title to the property to his son, but he's retaining peiros to himself. So although in a normal case I would say he who owns the peiros is considered the de facto owner. So the de facto owner, I would have thought this case was different. Why? I would have thought to both say that when it comes to a father and a son, a father is always happy to almost yield all of the rights to the son. So whereas normally Rabbi Yochanan will say, I say kinyan peiros is like kinyan guf, and therefore what? Because the father retained the peiros, therefore he really retains the real title. I would have thought maybe this case is different. That's in a case where you're selling it to another. But where you're giving it to your son, maybe in that case, a father together with the title gives over actual ownership of the land. Kamash Malan, no. Kamash Malan, that even with your kids, you want your stuff, right? Even with your kids, again, I'm happy to give my child, I'm happy to give my son the title. And remember, I'm only giving him the title in order to what I will say. This is a ksuva shelter, right? This is a ksuva shelter, right? At the end of the day, I'm doing this in order to avoid the ksuva lien devolving upon the property. So essentially, I'm going to do whatever I have to do to avoid ksuva liability, but I'm not ready to yield any additional rights. Therefore, Rabbi Yochanan will say, even in this case, I will still say kinyan peiros ke kinyan aguf, which means that what? The father retained, even though he gave over the title to the son, giving over the title to the son acts as a ksuva shelter. Therefore, the ksuva lien does not devolve upon the property. But the father who has the peiros still retains the real ownership. Therefore, according to Rabbi Yochanan, if the son sold his rights and then the son predeceased the father, the purchaser gets. The Gemara Reb Shimon Lakish or Rish Lakish will say, even though we normally say that kinyan peiros is laf kinyan aguf, which means we'll say that he who owns the produce is not considered to possess the title. For example, in the case of bikurim, the person who owns the fruits can bring, but he can't read the psukim. I would have thought, hacha, so therefore, in this case over here, where the father owns the fruit, but what? The son owns the title. The son has every right to go ahead and sell the title because he is the owner of the land. And therefore, the son predeceases the father. The purchaser still has his rights. And therefore, again, when the father dies, the purchaser could collect the land from the estate of the father. I would have thought this case is different. It's different. Why? Sakadait chamina kol legabe nafshe afilu b'makom brei nafshe adifalei. I would have thought the following. When do we say kinyan peiros lavke kinyan aguftami? So we'll say that's ultimately, again, when you're not retaining something for yourself. But in this case over here, meaning when you're selling the peiros to the other, but in this case over here, where it's the father, i.e. the owner of the property himself, who's retaining the peiros for himself, I would have thought that in this case, because he's retaining the peiros, therefore, again, he retains title for himself. So you both say, Rabbi Yochanan will say, Rish Lakish will say, that when do we say kinyan peiros lavke kinyan aguf, that having possession of peiros, of produce, of usage, is not the equivalent ultimately, again, to what? To having title. That's when you're selling the peiros to someone else. But when you're retaining those peiros for yourself, perhaps, again, that's when you want to retain some of the title for yourself as well. Kamash no, kamash on that even if you're retaining the peiros for yourself, still what to say? Still ultimately, again, we don't view kinyan peiros kinyan aguf. Therefore, although the father has usage, title ultimately goes to the son, and therefore what? Therefore, the son has the ability to sell the title, and therefore, even if the son predeceases the father, when the father dies, the purchaser has the right to go ahead and collect that property. So also, the point the Gemara is making over here is that you're right. Even though we knew this Machlocha and Rish Lakish beforehand, nevertheless, we had to apply it over here because this case has some specific novelties. I will say, just so you should know, at least in the case of Bikurim, I will say, we paskin like Rish Lakish, that kinyan peiros lav. Therefore, if you purchase produce, let's say I lease a field, I don't own it, and I want to bring bikurim. I have an obligation to bring bikurim. I have an obligation to bring because the fruit is mine, but I do the bikurim recitation because I do not own the land. At least for bikurim purposes, we say kinyan peiros lav ki kinyan aguftami. So the Gemara says, so let's at least begin this. We'll have to snap in a moment. So Rabbi Yochanan posed the kasha to Reish Lakish. What's the kasha? Chasi l'cha v'acharecha yirash ploni v'acharav yirash ploni. So let's listen to this case. A man says, life estate, right? Life estate. I'm hereby giving my property to you. So I say, Ruvain, Avram, I'm giving my property to you. And after you finish with it, right? After you finish means what? After you die, right? I wanted to go to Yitzchak. And this is not assuming, by the way, that they're father and son, just independent people. And after Yitzchak dies, I wanted to go to Yaakov. So what's the halacha? Meis Rishon Kana Sheni. When Avram dies, Yitzchak acquires it. Meis Sheni Kana Shlishi. When Yitzchak dies, Yaakov acquires it. Meis Sheni, Kana Shlishi. Meis Sheni B'Chayi Rishon. But I will say, let's say Yitzchak dies while Avram is still alive. So what happens then, I will say? What happens? So Yachsur Nechasim L'Yarshay Rishon. So I will say, if Yitzchak dies while Avram is still alive, then I will say that disrupts the flow. What happens when you disrupt the flow? Essentially what happens? Property remains with the first guy. It's actually interesting. So meaning if you disrupt the chain of the life estate stays with the first person. So in this case, again, life estate will stay with Avram, and when Avram dies, the life estate will go to his children. Now says the Gemara, says Rabbi Yochanan to Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish, if you really hold, that's what? If you really hold that kinyan peros is lavke kinyan aguf, if you hold, then we'll say, essentially, Rabbi Yochanan says to Reish Lakish, when you give a life estate, you're not really giving over title. What you're giving over, according to Rabbi Yochanan, is peros. If that's the case, then when Yitzchak dies while Avram is alive, we'll say, who should the estate go back to? It should go back to, what's the right word, the grantor? Is that the original? Right? The original owner. Shouldn't say that, it should go back to the original owner. Because we'll say all the original owner was giving the successive right of usage of peros. But apparently he was retaining title for himself. Therefore, if there's a disruption in the conveyance of the life estate, the property should go back up to the original individual. Then Isa, Reish Lakish, if you're right that King and Paris Lav King Aguf Tami, Liar She no Simi Baile, to which Reish Lakish responds, Amalei, Kavar Tirgimar of Hoshia Bava Lacharecha, Rav Hoshia of Bava already interpreted this. Excuse me, I'm sorry, I said that the wrong way. Kavar Tirgimar of Hoshia Bava Lacharecha, Acharecha Shiny. Any case, I will say Acharecha is different. When someone conveys property in this form of a life estate, what we call acharecha is a complete and total conveyance of both peros as well as title. Therefore, I will say what the grantor is giving is the grantor is saying, Avram, I hereby convey to you full estate, title and peros. When you die, it goes to Yitzchak. When he dies, it goes to Yaakov. So what the Gemara is saying over here is that ultimately, again, if Yitzchak dies while Avram is still alive, the property remains with Avram and his heirs. V'chin Rami Rabba Bar Avuna Kami Drav Arba V'Amar Acharecha Shiny. We'll say anytime you see Acharecha, the conveyance of a life estate is not just the conveyance of peros, rather it is a complete conveyance of actual title. And therefore, we'll say in this case, where the order, when the succession of the life estate is disrupted, it remains ultimately again with the first party and his heirs. We'll stop over here. Just so we're leaving off of the machlokes. Fundamentalists, Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. Rabbi Yochanan saying king and peros, king and aguf. Reish Lakish saying king and peros, lav king and aguf. The resolution of that machlokes and Yirtzeh Hashem tomorrow.
What's the story with the sharecropper?
You give something like the two witnesses and you say, hey, I'm going to be acquiring your money. The one receives must be a witness. You have to give it to someone in his support.
Somebody has to acquire that.
So someone else has to do the acquiring.
Correct. No. The witnesses can do the acquisition.
Also, they have to be separate. The witnesses who are
The
acquiring at the
witnesses
same
can do
time.
the acquisition.
Wonderful. That's easier.
What would be the of a sharecropper in court? Because a third goes to the owner, 2/3 goes to the. So that even though the guy is only getting a minority of the property and growing it, he brings to the court.
That is correct. It's actually it's a